The grand Hastings estate stood as a monument to old Southern wealth. Its tall, white columns gleamed in the fading sunlight, and the sprawling lawns were perfectly manicured as though untouched by the chaos of the world. Inside the mansion, Victoria Hastings sipped her tea in the drawing room, her posture as precise as the antique clock ticking softly behind her. She was every inch the image of refinement, her tailored ivory suit unwrinkled, her blonde hair coiffed to perfection. "Amelia!" Her voice sliced through the stillness of the house, sharp and demanding. In the kitchen, Amelia Carter tightened her grip on the dish she was drying. She sighed softly before composing herself and making her way to the drawing room. Amelia was a middle-aged woman with kind, tired eyes and an air of quiet strength. Dressed in a simple, pressed uniform, she moved with an understated grace. "Yes, ma'am," she said, keeping her voice steady as she entered. Victoria didn't look up. Instead, she stared at her teacup, swirling the liquid with a silver spoon. "The tea is lukewarm," she said coolly. "Did I ask for lukewarm tea, Amelia?" Amelia folded her hands in front of her. "No, ma'am. I'll prepare a fresh pot right away." Victoria finally raised her eyes, pinning Amelia with an icy stare. "And make sure this time you don't burn the leaves. It's not that difficult, is it? Even for you?" "No, ma'am," Amelia said quietly, her expression unchanging. As Amelia turned to leave, Victoria spoke again, her tone dripping with condescension. "I don't know how you've managed to stay here all these years, Amelia. You'd think by now you'd have learned to meet the standards of this household. I'd hate to think I'm wasting my generosity." Amelia paused in the doorway, but didn't turn around. "I'll make sure the tea is perfect this time, ma'am." Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "See that you do." In the kitchen, Amelia's hands trembled as she prepared the tea. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus on the task. Years of enduring Victoria's sharp tongue had taught her to keep her emotions locked away, but every word still left its mark. As she worked, a younger maid named Rosa approached her. Rosa was new to the Hastings household and still unaccustomed to its tensions. "She said something again, didn't she?" Rosa asked, her voice a whisper. Amelia glanced at her and gave a faint smile. "It's nothing I can't handle." Rosa frowned. "Why do you let her talk to you like that?" "It's not right." "Because it's not about right or wrong," Amelia replied, her tone steady. "It's about surviving." Before Rosa could respond, Victoria's voice echoed down the hall once more. "Amelia, where's that tea?" Amelia carried the tray to the drawing room with practiced precision. She placed a fresh cup in front of Victoria, careful not to spill a drop. Victoria took a sip and made a slight face. "Better, I suppose." She glanced at Amelia. "And next time, do try not to make me wait so long. Time is a luxury some of us can afford. But I'm not feeling generous today." "Yes, ma'am," Amelia replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "Speaking of time," Victoria continued, setting her cup down, "don't forget the guest rooms need preparing. My sister will be visiting next week, and I won't have her staying in anything less than perfection. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Victoria leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Good. At least you can follow instructions when you put your mind to it." Amelia turned to leave, but Victoria's next words stopped her in her tracks. "Oh, and Amelia?" "Yes, ma'am. Do try to smile every now and then. It's no wonder people like you always look so defeated." The words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. Amelia nodded once, her back straight, and left the room without another word. In the quiet of the kitchen, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge. The weight of Victoria's words pressed on her chest, but she refused to let them break her. Not here, not now. Later that evening, Amelia stood at the sink, washing dishes as the sun set over the estate. The soft hum of the crickets outside was a rare comfort in a house that rarely offered any. Rosa joined her, drying the plates and glancing at Amelia with concern. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Rosa asked. Amelia didn't answer immediately. She focused on the dish in her hands, scrubbing it until it gleamed. Finally, she said, "Sometimes, but not yet." "Why not?" You don't deserve this, Amelia. Amelia's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. No one deserves half the things life gives them. But we make do. Rosa didn't press further. She knew better than to push Amelia, whose resilience was as unyielding as the roots of an old oak tree. Upstairs, Victoria sat in her study, flipping through an old photo album. The images brought back memories of a childhood she rarely allowed herself to dwell on. The lavish parties, the grandiose holidays, and the estate's former glory, all of it felt distant now. But as she turned the pages, one photo made her pause. It was a picture of her family standing in front of their previous home, the one that had burned to the ground. Victoria, just a girl at the time, stood clutching a doll, her wide eyes staring into the camera. In the background, the house loomed, its tall windows reflecting the sunlight. She traced a finger over the image, her brow furrowing. The fire had been a defining moment in her life, but so much of it was a blur. She remembered the heat, the smoke, the terror, and a pair of arms lifting her to safety. Her mother had always called it a miracle. An angel saved you, she used to say. But the angel's face was a blank space in Victoria's memory. Shaking off the thought, she closed the album and set it aside. She had no time for nostalgia. There was a household to run, and she wouldn't let sentimentality cloud her judgment. But even as she moved on with her evening, the image of the fire lingered in her mind, a flicker of something unresolved stirring deep within her. Morning at the Hastings estate began with a rigid schedule dictated by Victoria's precise expectations. The sun had barely risen when Amelia Carter was already in the kitchen, her hands busy with the preparations for breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but the tension in the house was palpable. Victoria swept into the room like a cold breeze, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. She wore a tailored navy dress and pearls, every inch of her radiating authority. "Good morning, Amelia," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "Good morning, ma'am," Amelia replied, keeping her focus on the task at hand. Victoria picked up a slice of toast from the counter, inspecting it as though it were a relic of dubious origin. "Burn," she tossed it back onto the plate with a look of disdain. "Is it so difficult to manage something as simple as breakfast?" Amelia placed the last of the bacon on a platter and turned to Victoria. "I'll make another batch, ma'am." "Yes, you will," Victoria said, crossing her arms. "And while you're at it, be sure to clean the silverware. I noticed a spot on one of the forks last night. If guests saw that, it would be humiliating for this household." "Yes, ma'am," Amelia replied evenly, though her jaw tightened. Victoria tilted her head, scrutinizing Amelia like she was studying a flawed piece of art. "You know, Amelia, attention to detail is what separates mediocrity from excellence. Perhaps that's why you've struggled all your life. Lack of ambition, lack of discipline." Amelia's hand paused over the coffee pot, but she didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence was her best shield against Victoria's barbs. Rosa entered the kitchen then, carrying a basket of freshly laundered napkins. She froze when she saw Victoria, her youthful face paling slightly. "And you," Victoria said, turning her icy gaze to Rosa. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the dust on the dining room chandelier? It's appalling. Do you even check your work? Or do you just assume no one will care about your incompetence?" "I'll clean it right away, ma'am," Rosa stammered, clutching the basket to her chest. "See that you do," Victoria snapped. "This is a household of standards, not some backwoods shack." Rosa hurried out of the room, her eyes wide with embarrassment. Amelia's heart ached for the girl, but she remained composed. As the day wore on, Victoria's critical presence seemed to be everywhere. In the garden, she berated the groundskeeper for unevenly trimmed hedges. In the sitting room, she chastised the butler for a slight delay in serving her afternoon tea. And when Amelia passed her in the hallway, carrying a tray of freshly polished candlesticks, Victoria stopped her with a single word. "Amelia." "Yes, ma'am." Victoria gestured to the tray. "Do you call that polished? I can still see fingerprints. Are you even trying?" "I'll redo them, ma'am," Amelia said quietly. Victoria narrowed her eyes. "You know, Amelia, I've always wondered, why do you stay here?" Surely there are other places where your limited skills would be appreciated. Amelia held her gaze steady. This is my job, ma'am. I take pride in doing it well. Victoria let out a soft, mirthless laugh. Pride? In this? She shook her head. Oh, Amelia, sometimes I wonder if you truly understand your place in the world. Amelia's hands tightened around the tray, but her voice remained calm. I understand my place, ma'am. Victoria studied her for a moment, as if searching for cracks in Amelia's composure. Finding none, she waved her away. See that you finish those candlesticks before dinner. As Amelia walked back to the kitchen, Rosa intercepted her, her expression stormy. How do you do it? Rosa demanded in a hushed voice. How do you just stand there and take it? Amelia set the tray down on the counter and picked up a polishing cloth. It's not about me, Rosa. It's about the job. Rosa frowned. That's not fair. She treats you like you're nothing. Amelia met Rosa's gaze, her voice firm but gentle. People like Victoria Hastings only have as much power over you as you let them. Remember that. Rosa opened her mouth to reply, but stopped when Victoria's voice rang out from the dining room. Amelia, where is the silverware? Amelia sighed and picked up the tray, giving Rosa a small nod before heading out. Dinner that evening was an event as always. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flanked by a few well-dressed guests who had come to discuss business matters. Amelia and Rosa worked silently in the background, ensuring every detail was perfect. Amelia, Victoria called, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. Amelia approached the table. Yes, ma'am. Victoria held up a crystal glass, a small smudge barely visible near the rim. Do you see this? Is this what you call presentable? I'll replace it immediately, ma'am, Amelia said, taking the glass. Victoria sighed dramatically, shaking her head. This is precisely why I have to oversee everything myself. If I left it to you, this household would fall apart. The guests chuckled politely, but their smiles were thin, uncomfortable. Amelia replaced the glass and stepped back, her face an unreadable mask. As the dinner concluded and the guests departed, Amelia returned to the kitchen, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. She sat down at the small table, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a cup of tea. Rosa joined her, placing a hand on her arm. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Rosa said softly. Amelia gave her a tired smile. Strength isn't always a choice, Rosa. Sometimes it's just what's left. Upstairs, Victoria stood in her study, gazing out the window at the darkened estate. She felt a strange restlessness, an unease she couldn't quite place. Her eyes drifted to the photo album on her desk. Opening it again, she stared at the picture of her childhood home, the flames flickering in the back of her mind. For a brief moment, she thought of Amelia. Something about the woman had always felt familiar. Shaking off the thought, Victoria closed the album and turned out the light. The early hours of the morning found Victoria sitting alone in the drawing room, the photo album open in front of her. The faint light of a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. She traced her finger over the photograph of her childhood home, her mind swirling with memories of the fire. The faces of her parents, the laughter of her younger self. All of it seemed so distant now. But what lingered most was the vague image of the person who had carried her through the smoke and flames. Herb Angel, her mother had always said. Yet, why had no one ever spoken the Savior's name? Determined to uncover the truth, Victoria decided to seek answers. By late morning, Victoria was in the sitting room with her phone pressed to her ear. Yes, Mrs. Langley, she said, her voice measured. You were a close friend of my mother's, weren't you? I was wondering if you remembered anything about the fire, specifically the person who saved me. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Langley's voice wavered. Oh, Victoria, that was such a dreadful time. I do remember the talk of an angel. Your mother was so grateful, but I don't recall much else. Whoever it was disappeared before anyone could thank them properly. Victoria frowned, dissatisfaction settling in her chest. Disappeared? That doesn't make any sense. Well, dear, people come and go. Perhaps it wasn't someone you knew. Victoria ended the call with a curt thank you and sank into the sofa, frustration bubbling beneath her composed exterior. At lunch, Amelia set Victoria's plate down with her usual quiet efficiency. Victoria watched her for a moment, her thoughts turning over like restless waves. "Amelia," she said abruptly. Amelia stopped mid-step. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Amelia hesitated, confused. "Ma'am, I asked you to sit," Victoria repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Slowly, Amelia lowered herself into the chair, her posture rigid. She folded her hands in her lap, waiting. "Do you remember the fire at my family's old house?" Victoria asked, her piercing blue eyes fixed on Amelia. Amelia's hands tightened, but her face remained calm. "I've heard you speak of it before, ma'am." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "You've been in this house for a long time, Amelia. You must know something about it. Did anyone ever mention who saved me?" Amelia's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, ma'am. I wouldn't know anything about that." Victoria narrowed her eyes, studying Amelia's face. "I find that hard to believe. Someone saved me, Amelia. Someone risked their life to pull me from those flames, and yet no one seems to know who they were. Doesn't that strike you as strange?" "It's not my place to question such things, ma'am," Amelia said evenly, rising to her feet. "If that's all, I have work to attend to." Victoria watched her go, suspicion flickering in her mind. That afternoon, Victoria made a trip into town, visiting an old family acquaintance, Mr. Beaumont, who had been a guest at the estate on the night of the fire. He was a frail man now, his hands trembling as he sipped his tea. "The fire," he murmured, staring at the floor. "Terrible night. Your father lost so much." "I need to know who saved me, Mr. Beaumont," Victoria said, her voice firm. The old man shook his head. "I can't say for certain, Victoria, but there was talk. Your father wasn't happy about it." "Why not?" "There were whispers that it was one of the staff," Mr. Beaumont said, his voice dropping. "Your father didn't like the idea of being indebted to, well, someone beneath his station." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Are you saying my father knew who it was and said nothing?" "I can't say for sure," Beaumont repeated, his eyes darting away. Victoria left the house with more questions than answers. The idea of her father suppressing the truth unsettled her, but it also hardened her resolve. Back at the estate, Victoria confronted Amelia again. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, cornering Amelia in the hallway. "What do you know about the fire? About the person who saved me?" Amelia met Victoria's gaze, her calm exterior betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "I've already told you, ma'am. I don't know anything." Victoria stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. "I think you're lying to me, Amelia, and I don't tolerate liars in my house." Amelia's eyes flickered with something. Pain, perhaps, but she stood firm. "I have nothing to say, ma'am." "Then why do I feel like you're hiding something?" Victoria hissed. Before Amelia could respond, Rosa appeared at the end of the hallway, her eyes wide. "Is everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. Victoria straightened, smoothing her skirt. "Fine," she said curtly. She turned back to Amelia, her expression icy. "We're not finished here." Amelia watched her go, her hands trembling slightly. Rosa hurried to her side, concern etched on her face. "What was that about?" Rosa whispered. "Nothing," Amelia said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. That evening, Victoria sat in her study, a glass of wine in hand. The flickering candlelight cast a golden glow over the room, but her mind was far from peaceful. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. The whispers, the vague recollections, everything pointed to someone close to the family. Someone like Amelia. Her eyes landed on the photograph of the fire again. The faint image of the figure carrying her through the smoke tugged at her memory. Something about the posture, the silhouette. Victoria's breath caught. It couldn't be. Setting down her glass, she strode to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of old letters and photographs. She sifted through them feverishly, her heart pounding, and then she found it, a photograph of the household staff from that year. Her gaze landed on Amelia, younger but unmistakably the same. Her breath hitched as a flood of realization washed over her. Amelia was the one. Victoria couldn't sleep. The revelation swirled in her mind, refusing to settle. Amelia had saved her. The stoic woman she'd spent years criticizing, belittling, and taking for granted had risked her life to pull her from the fire. Victoria's chest tightened with guilt and disbelief as she stared at the photograph. The following morning, Victoria descended the grand staircase with an air of quiet determination. Amelia was in the dining room polishing the crystal chandelier, her movements slow and methodical. Victoria paused in the doorway, watching her. "Amelia," she said, her voice softer than usual. Amelia glanced over her shoulder. "Yes, ma'am?" "Join me in the study," Victoria said. Her tone left no room for argument, but it lacked its usual sharpness. Amelia hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be there shortly, ma'am." When Amelia entered the study, Victoria was seated at her desk, the photograph of the household staff placed squarely in the center. Amelia's steps faltered slightly when she saw it, but she recovered quickly, standing with her hands clasped in front of her. "Sit," Victoria said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Amelia obeyed, her expression guarded. Victoria studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Amelia frowned faintly. "Tell you what, ma'am?" Victoria tapped the photograph. "That you were the one who saved me from the fire. Why didn't you say anything?" Amelia's hands tightened in her lap. "Because it didn't matter." "Didn't matter?" Victoria's voice rose slightly, incredulous. "You saved my life, Amelia. That matters." Amelia's gaze didn't waver. "Not to your family, ma'am. They wouldn't have wanted to owe anything to someone like me." Victoria flinched at the quiet weight of the words. "That's not." She stopped herself, realizing she couldn't deny the truth of it. Her father's pride, her mother's insistence on maintaining appearances. It all aligned with what Amelia was saying. "You still should have told me," Victoria said, though her voice had lost its edge. Amelia tilted her head slightly. "And what would it have changed, ma'am? Would it have stopped you from looking down on me all these years?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure of how to respond. "Why did you do it?" Victoria asked finally. "Why risk your life for me?" Amelia's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "Because it was the right thing to do. You were just a child, ma'am. No one deserves to die like that, no matter who they are." Victoria's throat tightened. She looked down at the photograph, her polished nails tapping against the desk. "I've treated you terribly," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelia didn't respond, and the silence stretched between them. "I owe you everything," Victoria said, her voice firmer now. "And I've given you nothing but humiliation and disrespect." Amelia's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "We all have our roles to play, ma'am." "Don't," Victoria snapped, her eyes flashing. "Don't dismiss it like that. You're not some servant to be trampled on. You're the reason I'm alive." "And she faltered, emotion threatening to choke her. "I don't know how to make that right." Amelia leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and kind. "Sometimes, ma'am, it's not about making things right. It's about being better moving forward." Victoria blinked, surprised by the simplicity and wisdom of the words. She nodded slowly. "You're right, but I'm going to try, Amelia. I'm going to try to make things right, even if it takes the rest of my life." Amelia didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hope perhaps. The shift in the household dynamics was subtle at first. Victoria began taking more care with her words, speaking to the staff with a civility that had long been absent. She apologized to Rosa for her harshness, surprising the young maid so much that she nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. "I don't know what's gotten into her," Rosa whispered to Amelia later in the kitchen. "But I like it." Amelia smiled faintly, but said nothing. Victoria's efforts didn't stop at the household. She began attending town meetings, listening to the concerns of those in the community she had long ignored. She spoke to local leaders about initiatives to improve conditions for workers and offered funding for educational programs. One afternoon, Victoria approached Amelia in the garden, where she was tending to the flowers. "I wanted to ask for your help," Victoria said. Amelia straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "With what, ma'am?" "I want to create a scholarship fund for children in the community," Victoria said. but I don't know where to start. You know the people here better than I ever could. I thought you might have some ideas." Amelia raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You're asking for my input?" "Yes," Victoria said simply. Amelia studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll help." As weeks turned into months, the relationship between Victoria and Amelia began to shift. The tension that had defined their interactions for so long gave way to something resembling mutual respect. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Victoria joined Amelia on the porch where she was sitting with a cup of tea. "May I?" Victoria asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Amelia nodded. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the chirping of crickets filling the air. "I've been thinking about something you said," Victoria said finally. "What's that, ma'am?" "About being better moving forward," Victoria said. "I want you to know, I'm trying, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day I can earn your respect." Amelia glanced at her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Respect isn't something you have to earn, ma'am. It's something you give." Victoria smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. For the first time in years, the weight of her past felt a little lighter. The morning sun bathed the Hastings estate in a warm, golden light, but the atmosphere inside the mansion was markedly different. Gone were the sharp commands and icy glares. In their place was a newfound energy of collaboration and mutual respect. Victoria Hastings had become a woman transformed, and the change rippled through every corner of her household. Amelia Carter watched the transformation with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't that Victoria had become perfect. Her impatience still flared occasionally, and her tendency to overcompensate sometimes bordered on awkward. But for the first time, Amelia saw sincerity in her gestures, and that sincerity made all the difference. One evening, Victoria hosted a gathering at the estate. Unlike the lavish, exclusive parties of her past, this event was for the community. Neighbors, workers, and leaders gathered on the grand lawn, mingling as music played softly in the background. Amelia stood near the refreshment table, her sharp eye ensuring everything was running smoothly. Rosa sidled up to her, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Can you believe this?" Rosa whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "Victoria Hastings hosting a party for us common folk?" Amelia chuckled softly. "She's trying, Rosa. That counts for something." As the night wore on, Victoria stepped onto the small stage at the center of the lawn, a microphone in hand. She was dressed simply, her usual pearls replaced with understated jewelry. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady but humble. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I've spent most of my life believing that the world owed me something because of where I came from. I thought power meant control, and control meant respect. I see now how wrong I was." The crowd fell silent, her words carrying a weight that few had expected. "I owe everything to someone who stood in the shadows for far too long." Amelia Carter. Victoria paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Amelia. "You didn't just save my life during that fire all those years ago. You've shown me what it means to live with dignity, grace, and compassion. I'm ashamed of how I treated you, but I'm endlessly grateful for the lessons you've taught me, even when I didn't deserve them." A murmur ran through the crowd as Victoria gestured for Amelia to join her on the stage. Amelia hesitated, her heart pounding, but the encouraging smiles around her urged her forward. She climbed the steps, her steady demeanor belying the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Victoria turned to face her, microphone in hand. "I want to say this publicly because it's long overdue. Thank you, Amelia, for saving me, for enduring me, and for teaching me how to be better." Amelia nodded, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you, ma'am. But gratitude is best shown through action, not words." The crowd chuckled softly at the remark, but the sincerity in Amelia's tone struck a chord. Victoria smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I promise to keep showing it." Over the following months, the changes Victoria had begun implementing took root. The scholarship fund was launched, providing opportunities for dozens of children in the community. Victoria also established partnerships with local businesses to improve working conditions and offer fair wages. At the estate, Amelia's role shifted. She still worked in the household, but it was clear to everyone that her voice carried weight. Victoria often sought her counsel, and the two women formed a quiet but undeniable bond. One afternoon, Victoria found Amelia in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. "Amelia," she began, her tone softer than usual. "Yes, ma'am," Amelia replied without looking up. "I was wondering if you might consider taking on a new role here," Victoria said. Amelia straightened, turning to face her. "What kind of role?" "As an advisor," Victoria said. "To help me stay grounded, to keep me accountable. You've always had a way of seeing things clearly, and I could use that." Amelia studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "I'll think about it, ma'am." Victoria smiled. "That's all I can ask." Years later, the Hastings estate had become a symbol not of privilege, but of progress. Its gates, once closed to all but the elite, were now open to the community. Victoria's legacy was no longer defined by her family's wealth, but by the relationships she had rebuilt and the lives she had touched. On a quiet afternoon, Victoria and Amelia sat on the porch, their cups of tea steaming gently in the crisp air. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What's that, ma'am?" Amelia asked, her tone warm. "About the fire," Victoria said, "and how, in a way, it saved me too. It took me a long time to see it, but losing everything back then gave me a chance to start over now." Amelia nodded thoughtfully. "Life has a way of giving us what we need, even when we don't realize it at the time." Victoria smiled, a deep gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Amelia, for everything." Amelia returned the smile, her gaze steady. "And thank you, ma'am, for finally learning to listen." They sat together in peaceful silence.